At 17:15 on 3 July 1940, Admiral Marcel Gensoul ordered his battleships to slip their stern lines and fight their way out of Mers-el-Kébir, and France and Britain went to war. 11 days earlier, France had signed an armistice with Germany at Compiègne, and 2 days after that, a second armistice with Italy. Both came into force on 25 June. Article 8 of the German terms required the French fleet to assemble in designated ports and demobilize under German or Italian supervision, with a German undertaking that the ships would not be used for German ends. In London, that undertaking was worth nothing. Admiral François Darlan had told the British repeatedly that he would scuttle the fleet before he would let a German aboard it, and Churchill's war cabinet, weighing a promise against 4 modern capital ships, chose not to gamble. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. Force H had been assembled at Gibraltar in late June under Vice-Admiral Sir James Somerville, the battlecruiser Hood, the battleships Valiant and Resolution, the carrier Ark Royal, the cruisers Arethusa and Enterprise, and 11 destroyers. On the morning of 3 July it anchored off Oran. The terms went in by the destroyer Foxhound, carried by Captain Cedric Holland, a former naval attaché in Paris who had spent years cultivating the men he was now delivering an ultimatum to. Gensoul refused at first to receive him in person. That refusal cost hours, and the hours mattered. 4 options were offered: join the British and fight on, sail with reduced crews to a British port, sail to Martinique or an American port and demilitarize there, or scuttle where he lay within 6 hours. To Gensoul, every one of them read as a demand that a beaten ally surrender his honor to the fleet that had left Dunkirk. He signaled Darlan, he signaled the Admiralty at Nérac, and he watched the deadline close. What he decided in the last hour before it expired would set the shape of the war in the Mediterranean for 3 years. The harbor was a trap, and every French officer knew it. The squadron lay stern to the mole with bows facing inward, so a sortie meant backing out of a narrow channel in single file, 1 ship at a time, under the guns of a battle fleet already ranged in. Gensoul's alternative was to sit still and be shot to pieces at anchor. At 17:15 he chose the channel. Dunkerque came out first, Strasbourg behind her, the old Bretagne and Provence following, the seaplane carrier Commandant Testi and the 6 contre-torpilleurs, Mogador, Volta, Terrible, Lynx, Tigre, Cassant, spilling out into open water and turning hard to starboard. The French cleared the mole before Somerville's first salvo landed. That single fact changed the arithmetic of the afternoon. At Mers-el-Kébir, as it actually happened, the British fired at 16:54 into a stationary line, and the answer was almost silence. Bretagne blew up. Provence and Dunkerque were driven aground. Mogador lost her stern, and 1,297 French sailors died in under 15 minutes. Here the French squadron was already making 20 knots and turning inside the British line. Dunkerque and Strasbourg opened at close range with their forward quadruple turrets. The 194mm battery at Fort Santon, firing from the heights above the anchorage, straddled the British formation and kept straddling it. The contre-torpilleurs, the fastest destroyers in the world, and handled that day like it, laid smoke, and came in for a torpedo run through their own screen. Bretagne still died. She was 27 years old and could not run. Provence was gutted, but Hood took 2 heavy shells and a torpedo in the space of 4 minutes, and Resolution took 2 more, and the sea off Oran filled with oil from ships that Britain, in July 1940, could not replace. By nightfall, the forced raid had ceased to exist as a fighting formation. Gensoul was dead. Dunkirk was burning on the Algerian coast, and Strasbourg had been caught and finished in open water. The escape she made in the real timeline denied her by the very decision to fight. France lost a fleet. Britain lost the ships she could least spare at the exact moment the Luftwaffe was massing over the Channel, and every capital hull in the Royal Navy was already committed twice over. The political consequence was the one no one in London had modelled. In the real event, Vichy broke diplomatic relations, bombed Gibraltar in a token way, and stopped there, because the attack could still be described as a slaughter of men at their moorings, an atrocity to be endured. A fleet action was something else. Vichy did not have to invent the story. The French Navy had fought the Royal Navy at sea, gun to gun, and been destroyed doing it. Every newspaper in unoccupied France carried it as a battle, not a massacre. The distinction is subtle, and it was decisive. At Alexandria on 4 July, Vice-Admiral Godefroy's Force X was neutralized without a shot by private agreement with Admiral Cunningham, the last piece of Anglo-French good faith in the Mediterranean, concluded while the wreckage off Oran was still smoking. It was already irrelevant. On 12 July, the French state declared war on the United Kingdom. Darlan, who had spent a year insisting his ships would never serve a foreign power, now had a fleet, a grievance, and a reason. What Darlan committed was not trivial. The cruiser divisions at Toulon, the flotillas at Bizerte and Casablanca, the battleship Richelieu at Dakar since 23 June. The incomplete Jean Bart, lying at Casablanca, a force that, added to the Regia Marina, gave the Axis numerical superiority in the Mediterranean for the first time in the war. Ammiraglio Inigo Campioni now had a partner to coordinate with, instead of a threat to watch for. The staff work was difficult, the languages were mismatched, the two navies had spent a decade planning to fight each other. It functioned anyway, because both were pointed at the same enemy. The limiting factor was never hulls or crews, it was oil. France imported nearly all of hers, and every supplier of consequence, the Americas, the Persian Gulf, the Dutch East Indies, was now closed to her by the British blockade she had just joined the war against. Italy was in the same position and had been since June. Two fleets that could not both be fueled at once now shared a stockpile that was draining on a schedule nobody at Vichy or Supermarina could alter. The French fleet was a real weapon. It was also a depreciating one, and it had to be spent before it stopped being able to move. They spent it on geography. Bizerte opened to Axis use, and with it the Tunisian airfields, and the crossing from Sicily to Africa shrank from a run across open sea to a few hours of coastal water covered from both shores. The Sicilian Narrows had been a gap that Malta sat astride. Now they were a corridor, and Malta sat inside it. Convoys to Libya that had run at risk began to run almost unmolested, and Italian divisions in Cyrenaica received fuel and armor on a scale that the historical campaign never allowed them. General Sir Archibald Wavell, holding Egypt with what he had, watched a supply problem he had been counting on his enemy to suffer simply dissolve. And with French airfields in Morocco and Algeria active, Gibraltar itself came under regular attack from the west, not enough to close the base, but enough to make it a place ships repaired under bombardment rather than a secure hinge between two oceans. The Royal Navy's western anchor was now a front line. What that meant for the island 1,000 miles east of it became clear within a month. Malta in July 1940 was defended by a handful of Sea Gladiators and very few anti-aircraft guns under Lieutenant General Sir William Dobbie. In the real war, it survived because convoys could be fought through from Gibraltar at appalling cost by Force H. Force H was at the bottom of the sea off Oran. Everything now had to come the long way, from Alexandria, past Crete, through the Narrows into a channel covered by Italian aircraft from Sicily and French aircraft from Tunisia, and by two navies operating from ports on both flanks of the route. Cunningham held the eastern Mediterranean with a fleet designed to hold half of it and could not be strong enough at both ends at once. Convoy after convoy turned back or was cut apart. Dobbie's garrison went to reduced rations in the autumn, then reduced them again. In the Admiralty, the argument turned to whether the island could be held at all, not whether it should be, which no one doubted, but whether the arithmetic of tonnage and losses permitted it. Malta was never taken. It was simply neutralized, its strike aircraft grounded for want of fuel, its submarines withdrawn, its harbor a place ships avoided. The single most effective interdiction asset in the Mediterranean stopped interdicting anything. And while the Admiralty argued about the Central Sea, the position on Britain's eastern flank came apart entirely. General Eugène Mittelhauser had weighed continuing the war from French Mandate Syria in June 1940 and submitted to the armistice on 27 June. Under a Vichy at war with Britain, his successors had no such latitude and less inclination. The airfields at Aleppo, Rayak and Damascus opened to the Luftwaffe, not in the tentative, deniable way of the real May 1941, but as a standing arrangement between co-belligerents. The consequence reached Iraq. When Rashid Ali's rising came, it received the sustained air support it historically lacked, flown from Syrian fields a short hop away rather than staged through in penny packets and abandoned. The RAF training school at Habbaniyah, which in the real war held out for 5 days and broke the siege by its own improvisation, was overwhelmed. Britain's land bridge from Palestine to the Gulf was cut at its center. The Iraq Petroleum Company pipeline that carried Kirkuk crude west to Haifa was severed, and the parallel line to Tripoli in Lebanon now ran to a terminal in hostile hands. Wavell, already short in the western desert, was handed a second theater on his northern flank and a French army in it. And then came the moment that revealed what all of this had actually brought. The Axis position in the Mediterranean reached its widest extent and its least sustainable form at the same time. More ports than could be worked, more bases than could be garrisoned, more oil on paper. Kirkuk crude at a Lebanese terminal, Romanian output, the promise of the Gulf, and no tanker fleet to lift it, no bunker fuel to move the warships that had taken the ground, no merchant tonnage that hadn't already been sunk or laid up. A French battle fleet sat at Toulon and Bizerte with full magazines and empty tanks, the arithmetic that had governed the Mediterranean before the divergence governed it still. French belligerents had changed who held the shoreline. It had not created a single barrel of oil or a single ton of shipping. What had changed was the price of the reckoning. When America entered the war, the landing in French North Africa could not be the half-negotiated affair of the real November 1942, where local commanders were sounded out in advance and resistance collapsed in 3 days. It had to be fought as a full opposed invasion, against coastal batteries and a hostile fleet and an army that considered the Anglo-Americans the enemy who had killed their sailors at Oran. It cost months and it cost lives, and it happened anyway, because the industrial balance behind it had never been in doubt. Gensoul had perhaps 40 minutes to decide, with bad communications, an Allies' guns trained on his flagship, and a conception of honor that made 3 of the 4 British options unthinkable. In the timeline we inhabit, he waited, and his ships died at their moorings, and Vichy chose outrage over war. Here he moved, and a nation's grief found a target. The ships at the bottom of the bay were the same ships either way. What differed was what the living made of them.